Affairs Committee in our one-off session on the Internal Market Bill. There are going to be two evidence sessions today, one involving Scottish Government and constitutional expert Michael Keating and the other UK Government ministers. So without further ado, we'll introduce our first witnesses and we'll let them introduce themselves with any short introductory statement they may have. And we'll start with you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm Mike Russell. I'm the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs in the Scottish Government. I just want to make three very brief points. Firstly, the Scottish Parliament as a whole, by 90 to 28, rejected the Internal Market Bill on the 7th of October, and that was all the parties in the Parliament with the exception of the Conservatives. So the Scottish Parliament, to the greatest extent, is opposed to this bill. However, we're not opposed to having arrangements in place that would ensure the continuation of free and uninterrupted trade in these islands. We do regard the bill as being a solution in search of a problem. We believe that there is already a set of arrangements in place which can fulfil the objectives that the UK government have, and that is the common frameworks. They have been worked on for essentially more than 3 years. The objectives and principles behind the frameworks were laid out as long ago as December 2017 at a joint ministerial committee. And the work that has been done has produced a comprehensive set of agreements, some finalised and some provisional, which can be in place by the end of this year to govern this matter. Therefore, I very much agree with those members of the House of Lords who have been endeavouring to make amendment to the bill to make sure there's the common frameworks that are in place. We don't believe the bill is required. We believe there are other aspects of the bill that are very damaging indeed, and we may go on to those in terms of some of the proposals. But on this central issue that is in contention here, then Lord Hope's amendment today would address the issue of placing the frameworks in a primary position and making sure that there's not the imposition that is taking place in the bill and the negation of almost every power that the Scottish Parliament has.
I'm grateful. Thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary. Professor Keating.
Yes, I'm a professor of politics at the University of Aberdeen. I've been leading a research project on Europe, Brexit and the devolution settlement. It's generally agreed that something needs to be done to secure free trade within the UK after we leave the European single market, because it's the European single or internal market that secures free trade and market access within the United Kingdom. But I find this bill problematic on two accounts, one practical and one constitutional. On the practical question, the question is whether these wide powers are really needed when we've already got a process of negotiating policy frameworks. The powers in this bill are very wide-ranging. They have few exceptions compared even with the European single market, which has many more exceptions or single market measures in other countries. Whether this is really too drastic a solution for the extent of the problem. The second constitutional issue is that it introduces a new principle into the devolution settlement, because hitherto we've been operating on the reserved powers model. That is, all competences belong to the Scottish Parliament with two exceptions. One is powers expressly reserved to Westminster, and the second is a very general provision that the Scottish Parliament must legislate within European law. That's a broad transversal principle that applies to everything. Now, when we come out of the EU, that won't apply. This bill attempts, is one of a number of measures attempting to introduce that principle into UK law, but without all the safeguards that exist in the European arrangements. So yes, in the EU, there is such a broad provision which cuts across all kinds of fields, but is subject to proportionality, subsidiarity, the community method of making policy, qualified majority voting, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. None of that is present here. So this, to my mind, represents a major constitutional change. We don't know how important it will be because we just don't know what the scope of these single internal market provisions will be. But it is an important constitutional principle at stake here, and I think that deserves attention.
Okay, thank you both ever so much for your very concise contribution in the opening statement. Can I start with you, Cabinet Secretary? You and your Scottish Government colleagues have regularly called this a power grab, and that this bill somehow constrains devolution. But surely, as the UK Government claims, it's just a bill that devolves significant new powers to the Scottish Parliament. What could possibly be wrong with that?
Well, let me start by paying tribute to the bill's drafters. The bill is a clever bill. Because what the bill does, although it does take powers away, and particularly the state aid powers, which have been entirely accepted for the purpose of during devolution as being in the largest part devolved, what it does is it negates powers more than anything else. So if one was to use language entirely accurately, what it does is it means that the power of regulation, for example, in many areas, perhaps all areas, can be undermined by the way in which the principles are laid out, which Michael Keating has explained well. And that applies in a surprising number of areas. For example, I know members of the committee will have heard from the General Teaching Council for Scotland. The General Teaching Council are very concerned indeed that the powers they have to regulate the teaching profession, they are independently exercised powers, and indeed I was the Education Secretary who granted the General Teaching Council its independence. Those powers which are independently exercised will be undermined by the principle of mutual recognition, because what will take place is that those who do not have teaching qualifications in England will be able to essentially insist that they can teach in Scotland without the qualifications that the GTC quite properly, because it runs the register, has insisted upon. So it is a bill that undermines substantial numbers of powers, and that weakens the whole basis of devolution. The Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland have made similar points about the building regulation, which is not a matter that has ever been a dispute in terms of the difference of building regulations north and south of the border. And yet suddenly it has become an issue which could be underlined. So this is a cleverly constructed bill which weakens the basis of devolution and weakens the operation of devolution. And there is, and I go back to the point I made at the opening, there is an alternative. There is a viable, agreed alternative. And I do think that where such an alternative exists, it should be used.
Grateful. We'll come on to frameworks and the tension there is with the bill in the course of these proceedings. But I know the Scottish Government have also said that the market access principles, which are at the heart of the bill, means that decisions on standards taken in Scotland can be undermined, and Scotland would have to accept goods and services of a lower standard. But surely, as the UK Government says, this is just a matter of allowing Scottish producers access to markets right across the UK unfettered. Again, surely there can't be anything wrong with that suggestion and proposal.
Well, I think there are two areas of very substantial concern there. One is the ability of Scottish, because of the size of the market, of the producers to compete, but also the general principle that, bad drives out good. What you will have if you have a lower standard, that will drive out the higher standard in almost all circumstances. So I think that is clear in the generality. That is what will take place. But I think there's another issue, which is to do with policies set by the Scottish Parliament. If you take, for example, private sector procurement in the health service, there's generally a different point of view in Scotland. There's still a level of private sector procurement in the health service, but it's a different approach. I think it is clear from this bill. And of course, there are all sorts of caveats that will be applied. People will say, well, we've exempted this or we've exempted that. The powers are in the bill for UK ministers are very wide-ranging in terms of changing things subsequently. But in those circumstances, it would be possible for a health service provider, who was able to provide in England, to say, hang on, we want to provide in Scotland, we're not allowed to write, we're going to go to court. And indeed, I think it was Lord Callanan who pointed to this in the House of Lords in terms of the rights of bodies and corporations and others to have recourse to the law in these matters. The sheer unnecessary nature of this is one of the really frustrating things. There's no need for this to happen. We were very concerned about it when it was first mooted. We saw the direction of travel in this. Our own view is that the frameworks for the work we did, and this was the view, and this is the view of the Welsh Government too, they made entirely clear that the work we've all put into the frameworks, and we're still putting into the frameworks, is the right way to go ahead. And that also has been agreed with very widely by a range of bodies that have given evidence either to the House of Lords or made submissions.
Grateful. Professor Keating, thank you for your paper, and you prefaced it a little bit in your initial contribution. But the central tenet, I think, that you make with your paper is that you compare The European internal market, where you note that the rules are set, as you said, by intergovernmental negotiation and qualified majority voting, with the UK internal market, which will be set rules according to the UK Parliament. There is no consent or requirement or any mechanism for the devolved parliaments. What, in your view, what does that actually represent to devolution? And do you believe that this bill in its entirety and totality weakens or strengthens the whole concept of devolution as it has operated since the Scottish Parliament was first set up?
It exposes a problem that's always been present in the devolution settlement, namely that Westminster retains ultimate sovereignty, and it didn't need this bill to exercise those powers. It can do it any time it likes, but we work on the assumption that the Sewell Convention and other provisions meant that the UK government would not use its sovereignty constantly, and it would be accepted that the Scottish and the Welsh Parliaments, the Northern Ireland Assembly, will be free to act within their own provisions. This adopts a different principle because the internal market principle here is self-enforcing. It doesn't even need UK governments to intervene. It just needs individuals to exercise their rights there. And that's of concern because it means that the scope of this could extend, depending on judicial interpretation, on people going to the court, sometimes corporation with deep pockets going to the court to try and get decisions in its favour. This is the experience, in fact, of the European single market, which is not by any means perfect and has been criticised for excessively emphasising market principles as opposed to social or environmental principles. But at least there are safeguards, and there are not in this concern. What is missing in the UK system is any independent place where you can go to get the information on these. For example, what does the internal market consist of? What does it really mean in practice? Instead of an independent arbitrating body, you've got the Competition and Markets Authority, which is at arm's length from government, but appointed by the UK government, not intergovernmentally. And secondly, there's no arbitration mechanism that if there's a dispute here, that the UK government does get its own way. And finally, on the decision making, ultimately it's UK ministers who will, by statutory instrument, be able to change the scope of the application of this bill. So the safeguards that one might expect for the devolved governments and legislatures as a counterpart to the single market principle just seem to be lacking.
So possibly would you describe it as perhaps disingenuous to compare the operation or the proposed operation of the internal market bill with what currently happens in the European market as it applies to its own internal market rules and regulations?
Well, yes, the definition is and the mechanism is different. The European internal market has numerous exemptions. There's a very sweeping clause, which I think it has here. It's about grounds of public morality, public policy, public security. Well, public policy covers an awful lot of things, whereas in this bill, the exceptions are very tightly limited. So in the EU internal market, there's much more scope for governments to continue to regulate, whereas they think it is necessary to regulate the market. And as far as the mechanisms are concerned, internal market regulations have to be adopted in the Council of Ministers or the Council of the European Union by qualified majority vote. There's a large input by member state governments into that. And there is the principle of subsidiarity and proportionality. That is, measures must be taken at the level possible, and no more detail is necessary to achieve their objectives. And those principles can be appealed to the European Court of Justice. There's nothing like that. Those safeguards are not present here. Now, we don't know what the scope of this is going to be. It may be just that this will not be very important. It will only arise on rare occasions. But that's the problem. We just don't know what the impact of it is going to be. But constitutionally, it does seem highly problematic that it reflects what, in the words of the white paper on the internal market, is a unitary state. And some of us would understand this was no longer a unitary state. It was a state in which powers were devolved, and the devolved powers would be respected unless there was some very good reason for overcoming them, and that any encroachment on devolved powers would have to have a a pretty good justification.
Okay, thank you for that. And just lastly, and I suppose it's incumbent about introducing this at this stage in the proceedings, devolution is obviously the topic of the week. Prime Minister Questions has once again been dominated by the remarks of the Prime Minister, and I don't think it needs any reminding, but I will, just in case anybody's forgotten, where he described devolution as a disaster and the biggest mistake made by Tony Blair. I'm just wondering, and this is to you, Cabinet Secretary, I mean, do you think this sort of fits into a worldview about devolution? Does the internal market bill, and you've described this as an assault on democracy, do you think this sort of goes along with the theme of an aggressive unionism that this government has applied to devolution since the new Prime Minister's come in? And what do you make of this fitting in with this idea and concept of devolution being a disaster?
I suppose I would, if I were taking a historical perspective, I'd compare it to Henry VIII's The Rough Wooing of Scotland. If this is a constructive approach, it does seem to be very destructive. My own view is I'm not surprised by this. Mike Keating's referred to what devolution is. I think, to be entirely charitable and fair, I think there is a limited understanding of devolution at Westminster and also within the civil service, within officials. And I think that there is a dislike of devolution, which I've noticed particularly. I've been doing this job for, too long, 4.5 years now. I think I've been to every single joint ministerial committee on the European negotiations. And I've noticed a deterioration during that time and a dislike of devolution. And I think if you are strongly focused on Brexit, then you dislike anybody who's disagreeing with it. And you also dislike any idea that the power of Westminster can be constrained. The important thing about devolution is there is no hierarchy of governments. There is a hierarchy of parliaments. Governments have their own roles to fulfill, and that's what they're trying to do. This bill seeks to diminish the role of one part of that equation and to increase the power of another part of that equation. If that is what the UK government wish to do, then they should step forward with proposals to do it through the constitutional process rather than do it through the back door of Brexit.
Okay, thank you. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary and Professor Keating. I'm conscious the Chairman has taken up quite a lot of time already this afternoon, and time is limited, so please keep your answers as short as possible. Firstly, to the Cabinet Secretary, in terms of what Scotland sells to the rest of the UK goods and services, could you put a figure on the monetary value, please?
Not immediately, no, but you are going to make a point, and I accept the point that you believe that the internal market should be free and open, and therefore there would be a great disadvantage to Scotland if there were barriers within that market. I entirely agree with that point of view, but I see no reasons why there should be those barriers in the market. Nothing is threatening it, and the frameworks exist to assist in that process. I think there's also a secondary point, which is you don't have to be in the same political union to sell things one to another. If that was the case, then the UK wouldn't be Brexit.
So you can answer the question. It's £51.2 billion is the worth of goods and services that Scotland sells to the rest of the UK. And how much does that, percentage-wise, what percentage of the value of all Scottish exports does that represent, Cabinet Secretary?
As you pointed out, time is short. So what I'm doing is agreeing with the thesis that you have, that there should be no barriers, but I am pointing out that I don't think those barriers do exist, and I want that trade to continue and, of course, to be productive. So I think that answers the points that you're raising. I am not in dispute with you about these issues.
So it equates to 60% of all of Scotland's trade with the rest of the UK. Professor Keating, you spoke about your preference for the frameworks to be pursued rather than internal market bill. What would happen if the Scottish Government didn't agree the frameworks with the UK Government and the other parts of the UK?
Well, it's up to the still open to the UK to impose them. And indeed, it reserves the right to do this in the withdrawal bill and to take that competences or to limit competences if it should want to do that. Constitutionally, it's possible. The bigger question really is whether there may be any things that are not anticipated in the framework. New things may come up, and the most likely scenario there is in international trade agreements, something not anticipated. In that case, I think the governments might need to get together and discuss the need for a framework again in that case. The important point is that we can't really, in any devolved or federal arrangement, anticipate every problem that's going to come up. And nor can we assume that every problem that comes up will always be resolved on the basis and the interest and unilaterally by the central government. That's not what devolution is about. Devolution is about consent and agreement and trying to bring powers together. Now, if there was a crisis on a vastly important issue that the governments didn't agree and a Scottish government said we're not going to agree unreasonably, then Westminster still has the power to override. But there have actually been very few such cases in the history of devolution. I think most of this can be resolved. And the position of the UK government, or successive UK governments, I should say, is if there's ever going to be a problem about anything, we must give ourselves the power unilaterally to resolve that. That's really the understanding. This is not about Westminster trying to grab powers back. I've never believed that. It's just they want to anticipate that every problem will be resolved on their terms, and that's not the understanding some of us have about devolution or other decentralized and devolved systems, where if there's a disagreement, you don't just take the powers back. You've got to sit down and work it out. You work around those issues rather than just assuming that you can always get your own way.
But I think it is fair to say that the UK government should rightly be concerned about the operation of the UK internal market, given its economic worth. But I'm just sorry, I wasn't clear in my first question to you. If the frameworks cannot be agreed with the Scottish Government, and if the UK Government doesn't take action through the UK internal market bill, there would at least be the possibility for the Scottish Government to start taking decisions which would differentiate Scotland from the rest of the UK and would potentially make it much more difficult for businesses in my constituency and many other businesses across Scotland to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. A yes or no answer would be quite sufficient.
Yes, that might indeed be the case, because there may be good reasons for overcoming, for regulating markets. Even though that may interfere with the workers of the free market. There may be environmental, social, cultural, or other kinds of reasons why Scotland might want to regulate differently. The question is what the cost of that would be and what the cost of that would be to the rest of the UK.
And that could do harm, but that could make it more difficult for Scottish businesses to trade with the rest of the UK, potentially.
Well, if the UK government, in respect of England, imposed regulations to keep out Scottish suppliers, then absolutely yes.
Well, if the Scottish Government said to take action, which, for example, might require businesses in my constituency to label their products in a different way, they would find it much more difficult to sell, as they do just now in Berwick and Wolverhampton and Brighton across the UK, if the Scottish Government decided to take that type of action.
Well, if the UK Government, in respect of England and the Welsh Government, had legislated to exclude such goods, then yes, but that would be a decision by those governments, not by the Scottish Government.
But it isn't. But I think you're just reinforcing the point that it's important to have consistency for that reason.
There's always a balance here between the need to allow free trade and unfettered market access, which itself is a good thing, and the needs for regulation. And governments might have their own reasons for regulating products that might restrict market access. That's always going to be the case. That's the case at present. That's the case within the European single market. It's not unregulated. There's not complete free access. There are limitations which have to be justified according to the regulation.
But it's important, I think, just to finish, Chairman, that what you're proposing, the possibility of what you're describing, could have economic harm to businesses in my constituency and other parts of Scotland.
There could be a cost, yes, of course.
Yeah, fine. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the concerns of the GTC about their future control of teacher qualifications. Now, education, of course, is not on the exempted list, currently anyway in the bill. The UK Education Secretary was worryingly vague in answer to my colleague Carol Monaghan recently about whether the Scottish Government's powers to enable free tuition could potentially be curtailed under this bill if it goes through unamended. I wonder if you could talk a little to that, please.
I think it's difficult to draw a line, and say that is not going to be affected, and this is going to be affected because the powers proposed in this bill are so wide-ranging. It is perfectly possible that a disaffected individual or company or other could take legal action under almost any part of this bill. And that is one of the problems within it. The frameworks can be drawn more closely because they're focused on particular issues. And those frameworks can develop over time. And that's what all four administrations have agreed there should be. There is no veto on the frameworks, or rather there are 4 vetoes on the frameworks. And if the UK government were to decide it didn't like a framework, it could say so. That's why there is a link between the frameworks and the intergovernmental review. I'm sorry to overcomplicate this, but the process we've been engaged in for 2.5 years to try and get something moving on the intergovernmental review, which has been painful, I have to say, and incredibly slow. But the dispute resolution parts of the frameworks have actually been quite a productive part. So it is perfectly possible to put in place focused frameworks that deal with these issues in a way that respects the devolved settlement, and that's what we're trying to do. And the devolved settlement is also allowed for divergence. I mean, that is what exists within the European single market. It should exist within the internal market in these islands too. You would only oppose divergence of any description if perhaps you regarded devolution as a disaster.
Thank you very much. Professor Keating, you give some examples of internal market provisions elsewhere in the world. Could I ask what your thoughts are on the main differences between the UK's approach to this and what alternative routes to the bill's angle could have been taken that might have been a bit less disruptive?
Yes, on the 2 issues that I mentioned, the exceptions to this, how sweeping these provisions are. In other cases, they're much less drastic than this non-discrimination and mutual recognition provision. There's the case of Switzerland, which has such provisions because they were directly downloaded from the EU because it was in order to try and realise and implement their agreement with the EU. Those are the most sweeping ones, but even then, these things are resolved intergovernmentally rather than unilaterally by the federal government.
I think I was thinking, because you mentioned Canada and Switzerland in particular and the approaches they've taken there.
Yes. In the case of Canada, the internal market provisions are much less sweeping. There's no general provision. There are many exceptions in that. In the United States, they're virtually non-existent. In Spain, there is an internal market provision, even though they're covered by the EU internal market. They've got their own internal market bill. A provision for mutual recognition was struck down by the Constitutional Court because it said it was extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's one region legislating for what should happen in another region.
You mentioned in Canada there's a dispute resolution procedure, including arbitration. I just wanted to ask about the Competitions and Markets Authority and the intention to cite the Office for the Internal Market in that, which seems rather odd when it seems clear to me that the policy aim is to frankly drive down standards against the wishes of the devolved administrations. And I'm not clear at all how this authority will be accountable to the Scottish ministers or indeed to the Welsh ministers or the Northern Irish ministers. And I wondered about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, if I could just talk about what happens in some of the other countries as examples. In Spain that I was talking about just now, there's a Council for the Internal Market, which consists of representatives of the Spanish government and the 16 autonomous communities together. And attached to that is a secretariat, which will do all the homework. If an issue comes up, they will do the research, work out what the cost is, whether it does interfere with the internal market, and report. Remember, this is a body appointed jointly by the central government and the regional governments. And then there's an arbitration mechanism. If something is highlighted, they try and resolve it by agreement within the Council for the Single Market. If it's detailed, they pass it on to the sectoral committees, which is the equivalent to our joint ministerial committees, except that they vote by qualified majority as well. The central government can't unilaterally impose. It has to get at least some of the autonomous communities on its side. And that at the last resort, things will go to the courts. But the mechanisms are in place to make sure that these can be resolved by arbitration by research and by negotiation before that happens. Similarly, in the other cases, there's always an intergovernmental mechanism for negotiating and try and resolve these issues.
Indeed.
And in no case is the single market principle allowed to override existing constitutional provisions. That is, that the Canadian provinces, the Spanish regions, and so on, retain their own constitutional provisions, and so that they're able to insist on maintaining their own regulatory capacity. And if they surrender that, it's because they've done it by agreement with the other entities and with the other governments and with the central government.
Okay. That's
the principal concern. That's how federations work. And that, of course, differs from this principle, this bill, which is a bill unilaterally coming from Westminster, and which gives the advisory power to a commission appointed by the central government, and which gives to Westminster Whitehall ministers the power by statutory instruments to change the contours of the internal market.
Absolutely.
No
I just have one more question very quickly, if I may. Look, do you think it might help to address some of the great concerns that have been expressed from so many bodies? If the members of the Office for the Internal Market are appointed equally by each of the four administrations, because, I mean, perhaps, say, two of the four could be able to veto a nominee of one of the others. I mean, is it possible that the internal market could only work if such parity is observed?
Well, certainly that would help for the Competition and Markets Authority, or the bit of it that's going to deal with the internal market, to be appointed jointly, so as to get greater sensitivity for the devolved. But of course, that's only got an advisory role anyway. What we need on top of that is some kind of impartial arbitration mechanism, which we don't have under our present settlement. And then finally, a decision-making mechanism that doesn't give to the Westminster government and Westminster Parliament in various ways the last word in every occasion.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Andrew Bowie. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chair. Before I begin, I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary might want to revisit his remarks made a few minutes ago when he compared the current negotiations on the UK Internal Market Bill to the rough wooing of Scotland by Henry VIII, which of course was a war in the mid-16th century in which people actually died. But, I really wanted to focus on Part 6 of the bill, which is namely the spending powers that will be granted to the United Kingdom government to administer the Shared Prosperity Fund. The Scottish Government and yourself in particular, Cabinet Secretary, seem to have very strong opposition to this. Can you explain why?
I think there are a number of reasons for it, Mr. Barry. First of which is it didn't appear in the consultation at all. It actually appeared at the end of the consultation, so there was no opportunity to make representations on it. Second one is an issue of policy coherence. I think it is very important for government to be able to fund and take forward the policies that it has set. And if there is a competition within that, for example, if in the health service there was a desire to do one thing, and then another body, another government coming in and deciding to do another, you would have policy incoherence, and you would have money being spent by one government against another government. I think the third one is if this money is meant to replace monies that are coming from the EU, there has been an established system of engagement of a wide range of people in order to decide what the spending priorities are. And I think that was useful to have. There's no such commitment being given here. So what we appear to have here, we don't know very much about it and how it will in the end work out, but what we appear to have here is a set of decisions in which spending decisions will be made by the UK government on a set of priorities which have not been agreed with the Scottish Government or as far as we can see, with anybody else. So I think sitting down and discussing if there is more money to be spent, how that money could be spent, and working out the right way for all the partners to get engaged in it would have been a sensible thing to actually produce the result and to say that is what is going to happen. It neither respects a devolved settlement, nor does it lead to an efficient use of money.
I completely take on board what you say, Cabinet Secretary, but you can understand if you're sitting in Aberdeenshire or Aberdeen City Council that have seen year upon year budget cuts from the Scottish Government, have £400 per head less than the average local authorities spend per head, why having extra money from the UK government centrally to spend on specific projects would be a good thing. And I simply can't understand why the Scottish Government would be averse to that.
Well, I don't think this is the place to go into the issue of cutting, but if you wanted to, I would point out the number of cuts that have been made to the Scottish budget and the way in which the Scottish budget has been driven down. But the real issue here is how you get value for money and how you get coherent value for money. And I am absolutely not against a productive discussion on how the so-called shared prosperity fund might be used to replace, not that I wish to replace it, because I think Brexit is not a policy I agree with, but if that is what is happening, how you replace that money and target it most accurately. Let me give you an example from my own constituency. The regional fund, for example, regional development monies have been exceptionally important, as has money borrowed from the European Investment Bank for regional infrastructure. I can think of, for example, the desire of the people of the island of Ling to have a fixed link. Now, I'm keen to see that money come from anywhere it can. But there needs to be a discussion about how that fits into the policy coherence around providing links and transportation, and also an agreement of the partners, the local authority, certainly the local community should be engaged in that. There's a wider Highlands and Islands development issue. I don't think it helps simply to say, we're the UK government, we're going to spend money, we're going to spend money on what we want to spend that money on. That is not a mature approach to expenditure or governance.
But in principle, Cabinet Secretary, you wouldn't be averse to the UK government working with and agreeing directly with local authorities in Scotland how best to spend money that the UK government might be able to spend on specific projects. You wouldn't have a problem with the UK government engaging, for example, with Aberdeenshire Council on a specific transport project.
I have no objection to those people who are engaged in the issue, for example, of road development and transport projects being engaged. That includes, of course, the Scottish Government, because transportation is devolved. I have an objection to where there appears to be a wasteful use of public money, which is being used not necessarily in the best way possible and agreed between the partners. And the example you give is a very good one, because roads and transportation are a devolved matter. Surely it would be better to either recognise the devolved settlement or to reject the devolved settlement, not to appear to recognise it, but by your actions actually to reject it.
Well, I think we all agree that a wasteful use of taxpayers' money is indeed something that we want to avoid. I wonder if I could turn to Professor Keating. Professor Keating, what limits do you think would remain on the UK government's ability to spend on devolved areas should the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill actually come into law?
Well, I don't think there would be any limitations on that. This has practical implications and it has political implications. So far, the devolution settlement has been based upon a rather clear division of power. It compares well with other countries where things are rather untidy and confused and there's a lot of conflict about competence. Linked to that is the spending power. Scottish governments and Parliament have powers. They have the spending capacity within those, and that's worked pretty well. It has advantages for transparency and accountability and coherence of policy. This bill introduces a new power. The UK, of course, can spend in Scotland and does spend a lot of money in Scotland. A new general power to spend in devolved areas, and it's not quite clear what the rationale for it is. It will not mean that Scotland gets more money, because the UK government's going to give more money to Scotland at the expense of England and Wales. They will be sure to make their voice heard about that. It's a different way of allocating money. It's instead of the block grant and the Barnett formula, some money will be allocated directly to spending activities within Scotland. And one will want to know what the justification for that would be. What is missing? What is the problem here that is being addressed? I'm not quite sure what the problem is, what is lacking in the present system. The danger, of course, is the distortion of priorities. And because what typically happens in these kind of arrangements, as happens with the city deals which have been extended into Scotland, the UK government puts some money on the table, the Scottish government then has to put money on the table, local government has to put money on the table, and so the priorities may be set by whatever Westminster wants to do, rather than decisions that are made in Scotland. This has been the experience elsewhere. And there's always a danger of waste, of duplication of spending. So I'd want to know what the scope of this is. Maybe it's just about the shared prosperity fund, in which case, well, that's a small amount of money. and maybe it's harmless. But if it presages a general strategy for the UK government for spending in devolved areas, then I think that could have unfortunate consequences for the smooth operating of the devolution settlement and for accountability and for good policy making and clear priorities in policy.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Keating. I think before I hand back to you, Chair, I should point out that the UK government has promised and given a guarantee that there would be no diminution of the Barnett formula or any of the consequentials coming to Scotland as a result of this bill. And I think we should place that on the record just before we move on.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got UK ministers to follow this session, so we'll maybe get clarity on that as we go forward. Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question on the implications of Scottish Parliament. So given, this is to Professor Keating, if that's all right. Given that the UK Parliament has the unequivocal ability to amend the terms of reference of the Scottish Parliament and can extend or reduce the areas in which the Scottish Parliament can make laws, given that, what are the implications of the Scottish Parliament withholding legislative consent for the Internal Markets Bill?
Well, there are no legal or constitutional implications whatsoever. But until the UK withdrawal bill, this had never happened. And the Seoul Convention, whereby it won't do that, was working pretty well. And the UK government never showed any desire or intention to take back powers. And I still don't think the UK government is engaged in some kind of plot to take back powers for its own sake, because they could have done that anyway. This is a consequence of Brexit and of the working out of Brexit, which has raised new issues, which the UK government tends to resolve by saying, well, we will decide how this is going to work in the future ourselves, rather than, oh, here's a problem we've got to face with. We've now got a constitution and we've got to work within the new rules of this constitution, namely that the devolved governments have their own powers. As I said before, this was a problem waiting to happen at the outset of the evolution, because we didn't have an adequate entrenchment of the powers of the devolved administrations. But there was a certain respect. It just shows that the Seoul Convention and the other mechanisms were not capable of dealing with a crisis like this. It has serious implications. This is a test for the way that devolution works, and whether it is a genuine division of power or whether Westminster is merely lending powers to the devolved levels, feeling free to take them back wherever it's convenient.
Professor Keating, when we're looking at the UK Parliament, Scottish Parliament, the UK Government and Scottish Government, the UK Parliament is the supreme legislative body for the UK. So constitutionally, is the Scottish Parliament equal to the UK Parliament?
I would take the issue that supreme legislative body because we don't have a hierarchy of laws under the devolution settlement. We don't have a system whereby Westminster law always trumps the Scottish law. Laws are of the same status. We have a hierarchy in the sense that, in the last resort, Westminster can take powers back. But short of doing that, Scottish law has the same status as a Westminster law. And if the Scottish Parliament repeals an old Westminster law in Scotland, it can do that until Westminster takes it back and makes it a protective enactment. So we don't have that hierarchy. But what we're seeing here is an element of hierarchy, because we've got this internal market principle, which is very sweeping and which is hierarchically superior to the UK, to any devolved legislation that might get in the way. Now, that's how European law works. It is hierarchical. In any given field, the European law trumps a national law, but there are safeguards built into that, and those European laws are only adopted by agreement amongst the member states themselves. So what we've got here is the introduction of an element of legal hierarchy, while not having a safeguard for the devolved administrations and the devolved legislatures.
Professor Keating, sorry, you could maybe help us out by trying to ensure we get much more concise answers. We've got a few more members still to come in yet, and we want to try and get the UK Minister started at 4 o'clock. Sally-Anne.
Thank you, Chair. And just one more question to Professor Keating, really about, there's been quite a lot of speculation in the media about the President-elect Joe Biden and his comments regarding the UK and the EU and the Internal Markets Bill. Do you think that there would be any implications of this for Scotland, UK Internal Markets Bill?
No, the question in the main concern in the United States is the Irish Protocol and the provision of this bill that allows the UK ministers to override the Irish Protocol, which has been already agreed. I don't think Scotland really enters into that.
It doesn't, no.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Mary Black. Mary.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses as well. The student in me is currently fangirling at Professor Keating because I've read your work quite thoroughly. But my first question is for Mike Russell, if that's all right. There's two things that you've said which I would like you to expand on a little bit. The first one was in your opening statements. You spoke of encountering a general dislike of devolution. So I wondered if you could expand on that. And the second one was you spoke of that there were already viable agreed alternatives to this internal market bill. So I wonder if you could tell me about those alternatives, please. Thanks.
Of course, in terms of devolution, I mean, I actually think, with respect to Sally-Anne Hart's point, does illustrate it. There is no hierarchy of governments. There is a hierarchy of parliaments. And indeed, you could define devolution as being a delicate dance around the issue of Westminster sovereignty. And there is no supreme law in that regard. Not all powers are held at Westminster, and some of them are temporarily lent to the Scottish Parliament. The Scotland Act in Schedule 5 lays out the areas which the Scottish Government and Parliament is responsible for. Now, I think the failure to understand that is the situation has created a confusion about what devolution is. I think to add to that, and also confusion about how it's come about. I mean, with the greatest respect, I don't want to be unkind about this, some of us are very long in the tooth in this and look it because we've been through this experience. We were there when devolution was set up. And, devolution was not a creature of the SNP. There is not, the independence and devolution are not the same things. These are all these confusions that exist, which we need to clarify. Now, added to that, I think the process of Brexit has created a set of circumstances, regrettably, where many Brexiteers regard taking back of control as the key issue. And if you're going to take back control, then you look askance at other people who have any control. And you can't understand why that is the case. And I get that bafflement regularly when I speak to some senior people in the UK Tory government. They can't understand how this has come about. A good example has been during the pandemic. There's been a failure to understand that the health service in Scotland is completely devolved. In actual fact, it has been since 1948, since the health service was established. And it is those things that are causing more and more problems. And I think there is a genuine dislike of devolution in some figures. Well, we've seen it this week, some very senior figures in the UK government. And that has poisoned the atmosphere. And I regret that, because there are others I worked well with. Damien Green, for example, I would say was a very good chair of the JMC because he respected the devolved settlement. So was David Livingston. Actually, David Davis did too. We haven't seen that in recent times, regrettably. Now, the second one in terms of the alternatives is the issue of the frameworks. I presume we're going to get onto the frameworks in some way. The frameworks were brought, the idea of the frameworks developed in 2017. There was some considerable tension around it because the UK government presented it as a return of powers, which it wasn't. And the rhetoric of that compared to the rhetoric of the Brexit referendum was very stark, the contrast between the two. But by painstaking work, and particularly painstaking work by officials, there was a development of areas in which we could agree that some action was required. There was a huge long list. We started off with 158 areas of intersection between devolved powers, UK powers and European powers. We eventually got down to, I think the lowest we were ever at is 24, I think we're now just around 30, of areas where we needed some form of agreement to continue to operate the relationship that was existing, or gaps in the relationship that would open up because the UK was no longer part of the EU. And these have been subject to painstaking work. It's been interrupted 3 times, twice by no-deal preparations, which took precedence, and then by the pandemic. But we have a number of these that are in virtually final form and they are in front of committees, and indeed at the UK government ourselves have been corresponding about these in recent days, 1 or 2 of them. We have provisional frameworks for the other areas. We have made a commitment as a Welsh have to operate as if all the frameworks were in place. So this exists, and this takes care of those areas of relationship. Now, the one objection to this I've heard from the UK government...
Well, maybe have to wait for that Cabinet Secretary. I'm just very conscious of time, and I know that Ms Black has other questions, and as have...
I just have one other question for Professor Keating. See in clause 47, where it's talking about the financial assistance that the UK can give, it says in section B that it may be provided subject to conditions, which may include conditions about repayment. So am I reading that correctly when I understand that as saying that Scotland, the Scottish Parliament could potentially not give consent for a project, a UK project, and yet they might be responsible for paying back some form of money?
Professor Keating?
Yeah, I'm trying to find clause 47 here.
No, I'm sorry, it's very specific.
That's clause 47, financial assistance supplementary, is that right?
Yes, supplementary. Point B.
Well,
yeah. I mean, that's just financial assistance with loans. Sometimes financial assistance is given as a loan. Sometimes it's given as a grant with conditions, and it must be repaid if the conditions are not met. And I think this would be not referring to the Scottish Government, but to any individuals or enterprises that got financial assistance.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay.
Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Mary. Douglas Ross. Douglas.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses this afternoon. Mr Russell, can I start? Professor Keating said earlier, and I wrote this down, this is not about Westminster trying to grab powers back, and I noted you nodding in agreement. Just because Hansard can't pick that up, can you confirm you're in agreement with what Professor Keating said there?
What I agree is that it is not a crude power grab of the...
Mr Russell, sorry, we're asking specific questions. This is just a...
And I'm endeavouring to give a specific answer.
Sorry, Mr Russell, when I'm asking a question, if you can just listen. Do you agree with Professor Keating when he said this is not about Westminster trying to grab powers back?
What I indicated was an agreement that this is not a crude power grab. I actually paid tribute to drafting the bill. I think it's a very subtle power grab.
So Professor Keating said this is not about Westminster trying to grab powers back. That is verbatim what Professor Keating said. You nodded. Do you agree with that? Yes.
I believe that there is a very subtle power grab going on. I pay tribute to those who have been clever enough to devise it.
Sorry, Mr Russell, this is a serious committee and we need serious answers. Do you agree with what Professor Keating said? Yes or no? Agree?
I have indicated what my view is of that. I've done it twice. I'm happy to do it again.
So I'm sorry then, I will read the words out and you will say yes you agree or no you disagree. Do you agree with these words from Professor Keating earlier on in this meeting? This is not about Westminster trying to grab powers back. Yes or
I believe there is a very subtle power grab going on. That is what I've indicated.
Does that mean you disagree with the quote from Professor Keating earlier?
I've made it very clear. I believe there is a very subtle power grab going on.
I'm sorry, I don't know then if you agree or disagree with the quote.
I think the Cabinet Secretary has given his answer 3 times now, Douglas. Can we move on, or is there another way you want to rephrase that?
I would put on record, Chair, that a witness has failed to answer a question when I am giving a very specific comment. And I would give the Cabinet Secretary one more opportunity when I read out the words from Professor Keating. This is not about Westminster trying to grab powers back. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with Professor Keating on that?
For the 4th time, I believe there has been a very subtle power grab, and I pay tribute.
Let's
at this committee. Can I ask Mr Russell, what's your belief or understanding of the single market within the United Kingdom?
I believe that there should be unimpeded trade between all the parts of the United Kingdom. I'm a great fan of free trade, as indeed I understand the Conservative Party are.
Do you believe there is a single market in the United Kingdom?
I believe that there is an integral market, an integrated market, a market that we all benefit from. Single market is a technical term that applies particularly to the European single market. And I think in the terms that Professor Keating has described, for example, with the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality in it, then it's difficult to take that term across exactly.
So do you agree there is or there is not a single market in the United Kingdom?
I've indicated that the use of the term, the term is a very technical term. It's a term that's applied in the European single market. It is not exactly the same as that. I agree that there is a market in which there should be unimpeded access. I've tried to indicate to John Lamont, I'm not at war with you on this matter.
But do you agree or disagree that there is a single market, and is that your view or the Scottish Government's view, that there is or there is not a single market?
My view is that the use of the term single market refers to a particular technical thing within the EU. There is a market which should have as few barriers as possible. We are in agreement on that.
Does that reflect the views of the Scottish Government?
It does.
Thank you. Can I ask, because I want to come on to something, do you enjoy, I've got a company based in my Murray constituency called Baxter's Food Group. Do you enjoy products from Baxter's Food Group, a Scottish and UK global firm?
I do.
You do. Thank you. Could you confirm then that you would agree with Audrey Baxter, Executive Chairman and Chief Executive of Baxter's Food Group, when she says, and I quote, "We welcome the UK Government's internal market legislation, which will preserve and protect the current trading conditions. This will continue to guarantee a level playing field for companies like ours and is crucial to our continued success." Do you agree with
No, I don't agree with Audrey Baxter on that. I believe that there is another way of achieving the same end, which will be as productive for Baxter's, which is a celebrated company, and I celebrate their success.
Well, I'm sorry you don't agree with Ms Baxter, but I do welcome that you celebrate success, because some people within your party suggested it should be boycotted because they dared to accept a visit from the Prime Minister earlier this year. So it's good to get your clarification to fellow members of your party. Final question, if I can, Chair, to the Cabinet Secretary. You are coming towards the end of your career in elected office and within the Scottish Government, and you have been charged in your role as Cabinet Secretary to negotiate to the best of your abilities with the UK Government to deliver for Scotland. If you believe that you've not been able to do that, and you have been very critical of the UK Government, what has been your personal biggest failure during this time in the passage of this bill?
Oh, I would need to think very substantially about that, but perhaps my biggest failure to date has been to underestimate the extraordinary hostility which is being shown towards the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, Scottish people by the current UK Government, and perhaps some of those who are part of it.
But you have done nothing wrong. There are no personal failures that you think of.
There is a Gaelic proverb, Mr. Ross, that says it is at the end of the day that the fisherman tells of his fishing. I will undoubtedly reflect upon these matters, and I will be happy to share with you my own views of my either successes or failures at that time.
Orang Tang, I look forward to that.
One tang together.
We'll get round to writing Michael Russell's political epitaph at some point in the future, but we've still got a few more productive months yet, Cabinet Secretary. Lastly...
Oh, there's life in me yet, don't worry.
Lastly, Wendy Chamberlain. Wendy.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for their time today. Now, Cabinet Secretary, you did mention that you hoped we would get to common frameworks, and it's me that's covering that bit. Now, first of all, thinking about the Office for the Internal Market, in the white paper on the Internal Market Bill, and indeed in Part 4 of the bill itself, it was largely silent around a dispute resolution, other than written statements being tabled in the respective parliaments. But it seems that the UK Government is saying that the JMC, or that it should be managed any disputes via current internal mechanisms. So I just wanted to get your views in terms of, the JMC is supposed to be at the heart of our intergovernmental relationships. You've mentioned integrated review. Do you think a permanent JMC is a likely solution to the dispute resolution for the Internal Market Bill?
It's a very good and important question. I mean, the JMC has been a pretty hopeless vehicle for the governments to liaise together. The remit of the JMC-EN, which was set after Downing Street plenary of the JMC in I think October 2016 has never been fulfilled by the UK government. It's just been avoided. And indeed, there hasn't been a JMC plenary since December 2018, although there's one meant to be a minimum of once a year, there just hasn't been one. There's also a review of the intergovernmental relationship, which is, it is trying to come to a conclusion, but there is no agreement on dispute resolution. The best way to handle this, I'm not, and you will respect this as I respect your position, I don't believe devolution is the end point, but I work very constructively with the Welsh Government who have a different view. And Mark Drakeford, their present First Minister, who was my counterpart on the JMCN for a long period of time, and I both gave lectures at the Institute of Government some time ago, in which we looked at possible reforms and the way in which you would have quadrilaterals of ministers and perhaps a standing JMC, which was on the basis of equity and equality, that we were all working for the same thing. Now, there would have to be an arbitration or dispute resolution mechanism within that, but that was perfectly possible, but that has never been offered by the UK government. And if the UK government were to recognise that that's what should happen, then I think you would be able to make substantial progress on those issues. So, and I think Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland would all welcome that and would take part in it. So what we would want to see is a willingness by the UK government to accept that, rather than to be the sole arbiters, essentially, in any dispute. And that's where it is at the moment. In any dispute that exists, the UK government can say nothing to see here, move along, and there isn't a resolution. So there are ways to resolve this. It would be nice to see them happening.
Thank you. You mentioned the Welsh Government there. Now, my understanding is the Welsh Government have been working quite closely with members in the Lords in relation to the amendments that are obviously going through there. What engagement has the Scottish Government been having directly with the House of Lords?
I took part in the Welsh Government briefing. It was a Welsh and Scottish Government briefing of peers who were interested in this. We did that before under the withdrawal bill. And although I believe the world would be better served by this bill not existing, we have said that if there are amendments the Welsh Government has put forward, we encourage people to support them. And indeed, I have spoken with and continue to support a group of peers during this process. One or two have been Liberal Democrat peers, I have to say, and to provide them with information from the Scottish Government that I hope will help them undertake their task in the House of Lords. And indeed, I'm particularly interested today at the report stage, seeing where, for example, the amendment from Lord Hope will go.
And that takes us on to common frameworks. In terms of dispute resolution, could it be argued that the common frameworks could generally help avoid disputes? And what's your understanding of the impact that the bill has had on common frameworks development?
Well, common frameworks development will not come to fruition unless they are relied upon to be essentially the backbone of what we're trying to do here. But I was interested in Mr. Lamont's question when he said the Scottish Government could refuse to implement or refuse or walk away from the common frameworks. That applies to every partner, all four partners. Any of them could say we don't want to be part of this. So we need to have a dispute resolution mechanism, and that has been agreed as part of the common frameworks, in each of the common frameworks. And that, I think you could build upon that to have an intergovernmental dispute resolution procedure. The trouble is, if you don't give the common frameworks the space to breathe and become the foundation for this, that will not happen.
Absolutely. Okay. Professor Keating, have you got anything else to add in relation to anything that I've asked so far?
It'll have to be very quick, Professor Keating.
Yeah, on the Joint Ministerial Committee set up, the problem there is that the Westminster Government always has the last word. There needs to be something more horizontal there, some procedure, some better research mechanism, some better arbitration mechanism, and something the Welsh Government has suggested, a council of ministers with qualified majority voting, something like that. Maybe it won't be needed all the time, but if the Westminster Government can always have the last word, that affects not just the last word, but everything that goes before it.
Okay. Thank you ever so much. That's all we've got time for. But can I just thank you both, Cabinet Secretary? It's always good to see you again at the committee, and you too, Professor Keating. If there's anything else that you could help us with this very short look at the internal market bill, we'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you for your time. And we now go